Did Jesus rise from the dead? That's a question we're going to explore in this video. Now, what does that have to do with our Christian faith? If you're a Christian, obviously you believe that Jesus rose from the dead. Or maybe you have some doubts about that. That's a reason, one of the reasons to know apologetics, which this is a part of a series of videos under playlist on our channel, Bethel Pittsburgh. The playlist is called The Disciple. And you'll notice the videos in the playlist have categories, and one of those categories is apologetics. We've already gone over we've done a couple of videos on apologetics, some general things that are good to know moving forward. But one of the reasons to know that is because if I'm having my own set of doubts, I need to know what the answers are to those struggles. If maybe it might be preventative, maybe I might come across some of these questions at some point, and me knowing this stuff will help me kind of shrug that off. Or if I'm witnessing to someone and this is an obstacle for them, then I can help them remove that obstacle to see if that's the only reason they're not coming to Christ. And one of those obstacles is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Now, there are a lot of resources out there that are more thorough than what I'm going to give in this video, and most of those resources is where I'm pulling this information from. So I'm going to give some of those in the description below, some links to some online articles and maybe a video or two in there. But did Jesus rise from the dead? How do we know that he did? Well, first we should start with what is accepted by most people. So there was a historical thing that happened. At the very least, we know that Christianity exists, and one of the core tenets of the Christian faith is that Jesus Christ was crucified and rose from the dead. Now, if you were to study history, that belief went way back into history, all the way down to the first century. Where in the world did that come from? And was it a legend? Was it a fairy tale? Or was it a historical fact? But we know that it exists, so the story at least came from somewhere. And the story came out of, a lot of people they tend to think that the Christian church was trying to control everything. So they controlled history to make it say that Jesus rose from the dead. The problem with that is that the Roman Empire did not become a Christian nation until the 4th century, when Constantine declared it to be a Christian empire. The Christian church began in the 1st century, 300 years prior to that, and that belief was persecuted. The church was heavily persecuted to a greater or lesser degree throughout those 300 years. And for that story to survive those 300 years, and Constantine just kind of picked it up. But the story survived intense persecution. The Christians didn't have control of anything prior to that 4th century. So this story came from somewhere, and people wrestle with where did it come from. And if you were to study the most reasonable objections to Jesus's resurrection, you would find that they all end up validating 4 core elements to the story. If you were to study history, you would find that history validates 4 core elements to the story. And they're elements that a typical person who embraces historical evidence, even the opponents of the resurrection, embrace these 4 ideas, and that's the starting point. The first is that Jesus existed. There was a historical Jesus that did exist. The second is that he was executed by crucifixion. The third is that the disciples did claim that Jesus rose from the dead. And fourthly, those disciples or apostles were executed for their faith, still holding on to all the way through their moment of death the claim that Jesus rose from the dead. So those four elements are there. So if the typical person embraces those things, then really what we're wrestling with is the explanation to those four issues. In fact, I actually would throw a fifth one in there, and that is the tomb was empty. Where did the body go? That's another element to that. So the most common theories are that first would be that Jesus survived the crucifixion. Now again, that claim validates those five core beliefs. The person who's claiming that Jesus survived is accepting that Jesus existed, accepting that he was crucified, accepting that the tomb was empty, accepting that the disciples claimed that he rose from the dead, and accepts the martyrdom of the disciples while claiming that he was dead. So that is something that cannot, so it's accepting those theories. But the issue is, if you were to study crucifixion, and know first century culture on top of it, you would know there's no way he survived that, first of all. And let's even say hypothetically he did. How do you explain the radical life change in the disciples? To see a bloody, bruised, seriously injured, mangled person still alive is a testimony to the power of Jesus Christ. That just doesn't make sense to what unfolded after that. So it's really not a good explanation, and it really flies in the face of any medical understanding of crucifixion in the first century. So that's one theory, but it just doesn't make sense of what took place. Another theory is the conspiracy theory, the idea that the disciples stole the body and made the whole thing up. That again is accepting the five basic beliefs that Jesus did exist, that he did get crucified, that the tomb was empty, that the disciples claimed that all the way to the point of death. It might make sense of some of those elements, the tomb being empty, Jesus existing, some of those things might make sense of, but what is hard to make sense of with that theory is, first of all, why in the world did they let themselves get executed for that claim? Because typically when you have a conspiracy theory, there's something that you're gaining, like material wealth, which if that was the case, which it certainly wasn't, but if that was the case, their martyrdom would cause them to lose that wealth. Fame, which if that were the case, their death isn't really going to help with that, but maybe they were dying and hoping to be famous in their death. But the problem is that how did they keep that secret? Because again, it was intensely persecuted, the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. There were so many enemies trying to prove that wasn't the case, and these guys were being tortured for that, and they were still holding on to that claim in the face of torture. It's an awful lot. They were tortured separate from each other. They weren't even in connection with each other, so they couldn't collaborate their stories, and yet the story stayed consistent over a long period of time with a lot of people, because the claim was that Jesus appeared to like hundreds of people. And so when you have like hundreds of people involved in a conspiracy, it's really hard to hold that secret for very long, and especially under intense pressure and scrutiny. So the idea that survived that is really not reasonable to accept. And still, it's kind of odd to think that they would die for that claim that they would have known. It's one thing like a suicide bomber in the Muslim faith are dying for their faith, but they didn't see it firsthand. They're just believing what Muhammad told them through the Quran. The first century Christians were dying for the idea of the resurrection, which they claimed to see firsthand. So they would have known that it was false. It doesn't make sense to the details of the story. The third most common one is that they hallucinated. They really sincerely believed that they saw Jesus Christ. One of the biggest issues with that is that Jesus appeared to people, multiple people at the same time. And it's really just kind of hard to explain that because people don't have group hallucinations. Hallucinations take place within your mind, the mind of the individual. So we can't share hallucinations, so it's not possible to see the same thing in a hallucination. So the groups of them seeing that together just contradicts that idea. So again, Jesus existed. He was crucified. The tomb was empty. The disciples claimed that he rose from the dead, and the disciples died in the face of that claim. None of the explanations explain that entire picture. The only explanation that really explains how that happened is the resurrection. The resurrection is the only one that makes sense of all five of those historical realities. Jesus existed. Resurrection embraces that. Jesus was crucified. The resurrection embraces that. The tomb is empty. Resurrection embraces that. The disciples were radically transformed and claimed that Jesus rose from the dead. Fits the picture. The disciples went to their deathbed, execution, tortured and executed, holding on to that claim. Makes total sense of encountering a resurrected Jesus Christ. So those are things to think through when we think through the resurrection. Again, I'm going to put some resources, some links in the description for further study. There's other places to study this, but I encourage you, don't just accept that people say, yeah, he didn't rise from the dead. Push people on that because the evidence is largely in the favor that Jesus rose from the dead. If you have any questions on that or feedback on the content of this video, leave that in the comments. We'd be glad to respond to you. If you would like to grow in your faith in person and you live in the Pittsburgh area, we'd love for you to join us at Bethel Assembly of God, 2501 Staten Street, Wednesdays at 6:30 and Sundays at 10 a.m. God bless.